There are some cases that don't just shock you, they unsettle you in a way that lingers because they challenge something very basic about the way we understand humanity, responsibility, and protection. Today's case is one of those. It involves a newborn baby who was only 8 days old, a moment in time where life should be at its most protected, most fragile, and most fiercely guarded. Instead, that window would become the setting for something so disturbing that even seasoned investigators would struggle to articulate. This is an episode about power, about vulnerability, about the consequences of choices made when no one is watching. This is the story of the disturbing and tragic murder of Caithlyn Ferreira. Hello and welcome back to Murder Mayhem, a Bella Monsoon exclusive production. If you haven't caught up on my first case of the year, the Devonay Nell case, I've linked it in a card above for you to check out. So jumping straight in, today's episode is heavy, and honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you struggle to get through it. This is a case that made, and to be honest, still makes me both sick to my stomach as well as completely enraged simultaneously. But before we get into it, for those of you who are new, let me quickly introduce myself and tell you a little bit more about what I do here. For those of you who are returning, you know the drill by now. You can skip ahead using the timestamp on screen. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a registered mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with psychology, true crime, and understanding the motives that drive people to do what they do. My knowledge and experience within the field thus led me to create the first South African trauma-informed true crime series. This means that I post documentary-styled episodes looking at real-life crimes from a psychological viewpoint. During these episodes, I also try to share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not be familiar with in an easy-to-understand format. So if that is something that seems like it is right up your alley, then please do consider subscribing and joining the Bellaboo fam. But if you're more a fan of podcasts, no worries. I got you covered, and trust me, I will not hold it against you. You can find me for my sister podcast, Murder Mayhem South African True Crime, available to stream on all major streaming channels. Yes, like all of them. So just a quick disclaimer, today's episode contains material citing the murder and the assault of an infant. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victim mentioned nor her family. The purpose of this video is purely to spread awareness around the heinous crime that was committed, whilst shedding light on the psychological nature of the narrative. This story has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes publicly accessible real-life accounts, video and footage of and from individuals involved directly in the case. So without further delay, let's get into it. If you're familiar with my episodes, you'll know that I always start by telling you about the victim, about who they were, the life that they led, and the things that matter to them before everything was taken away. But today is different. Because today, the victim was only 8 days old. She was a baby that didn't have a story yet. She hadn't had time to become anything or anyone. No memories, no milestones, no chance to grow into a personality or a future. At 8 days old, there's only one instinct that matters: survival. She depended completely on the adults around her to keep her alive, to protect her, to respond to her when she cried. But instead of protection, she experienced the opposite. Because one of the people who helped to bring her into this world, who was supposed to keep her safe, would hurt her in the most unimaginable way possible. So we're going to start this episode by meeting him, Hugo Ferreira. As a child, Hugo was raised by his grandparents after his father absconded and his mother had left for Johannesburg to find work in order to provide for her child. He would later say that he preferred life with his grandparents, as his mother had allegedly dated some violent men who would apparently assault her, men who would apparently attack him, when he, as a young boy, had tried to intervene and help her. He would later state that his childhood with his grandparents was happy and he felt like he was spoilt. But all of that started to change in grade 1 when his grandfather had passed away. But keep in mind though, his positive recollections are exactly that, his. Other family members would often recall him being extremely aggressive, destroying so many of his grandparents' household items in fits of rage. They would attest to his later violent nature when he would come asking his mother for money to buy drugs. Instead of his version of protecting his mother against these abusive men, their versions saw him being the alleged abuser. On one occasion in particular, apparently dragging his mother by her hair across cement flooring in front of other family members. And this was apparently a normal occurrence. Both other family members as well as his own mother would attest to the multiple injuries that she had sustained. However, she had not filed one police complaint because she felt guilty for being such an absent mother within his childhood. So by grade 8, he had started drinking, using drugs, he ended up leaving school, and he went to go work as a car mechanic. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that one panned out, as he was obviously still a child at the time, but yeah. He then at some point entered a long-term relationship, which ultimately ended before he had met the woman he had married for 4 years. During this entire period, throughout his marriage, he was also using drugs. His marriage, unsurprisingly, would come to a tumultuous end. He would later claim that his wife had cheated on him back in 2021, which at that point he stated he lost all control. Later, this would be the moment that he would reference as a turning point, in his eyes at least. After learning about his wife's alleged betrayal, he would apparently cry for weeks, not leave the home, as well as vandalize the property. Yeah, I'm talking about breaking all the furniture, removing bathtubs, removing electrical cables, flooding the house, but also setting other parts of it on fire. His wife at the time, not yet ex-wife, had obviously shared the property with them and had many of her belongings within the home. So like any normal person would, she had filed a charge of malicious damage to the property and she had obtained a protection order against him. And then she had moved out of the home and away from that level of toxicity. And this series of events would ultimately lead Hugo to cross the path of Maureen Brandt. At the time, according to Hugo, she had been living on the streets and living a tough and rough life where she had resorted to hustling and begging on the daily in order to get the things that she wanted and needed. Right, so after Hugo had destroyed the home that he had previously shared with his wife, after he had been dealt the protection order, he would ultimately lose his job. Yeah, a super quick devolving situation. At this point, he then decided he was going to stick with Maureen, and the two had lived together in abandoned houses over the next months. Their means of survival and feeding their addictions came from begging outside of shops and in the streets. So now that you have an idea of how we got to this point, our narrative takes us to June of 2023, where 37-year-old Hugo Ferreira was still in a relationship, if you could call it that, with Maureen. The pair at the time were living in a back room of the old railway houses of Valverdien in Carletonville. According to multiple sources, substance abuse, particularly methamphetamines, was a part of daily life. So just for some quick context for those of you who are not aware of the area, Carletonville is a mining town about an hour outside of Johannesburg, built largely around South Africa's gold industry. Like many mining towns, it's a place of contrast. Strong community ties on one hand, and on the other, the long-term impact of economic instability, unemployment, and social strain. Over the years, substance abuse has been a reoccurring issue, raised by police as well as community organizations in the area. Drug-related crimes regularly appear in local crime statistics, often as a result of police-driven operations rather than random reporting. Community groups have also spoken openly about how limited access to rehabilitation and support services leave many people cycling through addiction without real intervention. So whilst that context matters, it's important to really be clear about something. The environment can definitely explain pressure, but it doesn't explain violence like this. It provides background, not blame. Because the truth of the matter is, plenty of people are living in Carltonville, experiencing these types of stresses, living similar lives, but they are never harming anyone, let alone an infant. That being said though, let's get back to Hugo and Maureen. Their relationship, as you can imagine, like their everyday life, was tumultuous. Maureen, who had been unhoused for many years prior, had lost custody of her 4 children due to severe neglect. Despite this, she had fallen pregnant once again, allegedly not something she had planned nor wanted, according to those who knew the couple. But regardless, at the beginning of June 2023, a baby girl would enter the world, a little earlier than expected. A baby girl whom at least 2 different people, Hugo's mother as well as his cousin, had offered to take in and look after, but the couple had refused. And this little girl's name would be Caithlyn. And so Caithlyn came to live in the back room of a railway house. A room with only a steel cabinet, a mattress, and a baby cot that Hugo's mother had given them. It was a residence, but most certainly not a home. And that had nothing to do with just the furnishings. So our narrative brings us to the day in question, the 8th of June 2023. The pair had been arguing yet again. Maureen, desperate for some money, wanted to leave the home to go and sell some of baby Caithlyn's clothing, as well as ask her ex-boyfriend for money, to ensure that the pair could buy food and diapers, allegedly, but most likely also to have the funds to feed their addictions. Because keep in mind that during the pregnancy, the pair had asked family members for money for scans and doctor examinations, but had ended up often using the funds to buy food or feed their addictions. I mean, despite borrowing the money to register Caithlyn's birth, it would later turn out at her autopsy that her birth had never even been registered. So the couple began to argue that day. Hugo was furious that Maureen always approached her ex-boyfriend for money. He had then raised his hand to her, and after slapping her across the face, she had screamed and left the room. In leaving, she had entrusted baby Caithlyn with her father. Before she left though, Hugo had issued her a warning to be back in 5 minutes because she was breastfeeding and baby Caithlyn would be hungry. And as she walked out the door, leaving the fully clothed 8-day-old infant in his care, Maureen could not have any clue of the horrors that were about to take place. In the sparse home, left alone with her father, baby Caithlyn began to cry. Cry because she was hungry perhaps, or tired of sitting in her wet diaper, or perhaps just uncomfortable getting used to a life outside of the womb she had known for the past months. Hugo, already irritated at this point, had removed baby Caithlyn's diaper and clothing, only to realize that there was no dry clothing available as Maureen had allegedly taken it all. And so now, unclothed, keeping in mind that it was wintertime as June is winter in South Africa, baby Caithlyn continued to cry. Still fuming at Maureen and now irritated by Caithlyn's cries, Hugo decided in that moment, in his own words as he would state later, mind you, that he was going to give her something to cry about. Yes, unfortunately, you heard me correctly. A grown man, the father of this infant. Now for this next part, we only have his version of events. If you are a sensitive listener and you've made it thus far, perhaps you may want to skip the next part. Honestly, if I could have unheard what I'm about to tell you, I very well may have. So, as the recount goes, apparently Hugo had hit Caithlyn on her buttocks before pushing her face down on the mattress where he was allegedly changing her diaper. And in this even more vulnerable position, he had forced his fingers inside of her. Next, he had lowered his pants and rubbed himself against her unclothed body. She continued to cry, I'm sure even louder now, but he continued to hurt her, this time picking her up by her neck and throwing her to the ground. He repeated these disturbing acts several times. Baby Caithlyn would lose consciousness several times, but every time she would regain it, she would let out howls of anguish and pain. I honestly cannot imagine what that little girl had to endure. Eventually, she began to turn yellow. She struggled to breathe and she raised her arms. At this point, Hugo apparently realized what he had done, and so he had taken the baby out of the home to avoid Maureen seeing her when she returned. In doing so, instead of taking her to a hospital, he denied her the medical assistance she so desperately needed. And so it is alleged that he had fled to his mother's home, which was also in the area. There he had told his mother that he had dropped Caithlyn onto the ground and she had landed on his shoes. Yeah, that is the story that he ended up going with. Upon returning home later that evening, hours that baby Caithlyn received no medical attention whatsoever, he refused to hand the baby over to Maureen. When he eventually did, she immediately saw that something was wrong. She called the landlord, the owners of the property, and they called the police, the ambulance, and everyone really. A short while later, community members, police, and the ambulance arrived. Baby Caithlyn was immediately rushed to the Carltonville Hospital, but unfortunately, she would later succumb the very next morning to her extensive injuries. And of course, you guessed it, Hugo Ferreira was arrested. A later post-mortem would showcase that the cause of passing was trauma to the head, and she had sustained far more injuries than Hugo would ever confess to. Injuries that I'm about to mention, so please skip this part if you just cannot bear to hear it. Trust me, I'll understand. At the time of her passing, 8-day-old baby Caithlyn only weighed 2.4 kilograms. Her 43-centimeter long body was almost completely covered in blood, reddish-purple bruises, and abrasions. 20 millimeters of blood would be drained from the space between her skull and skin, just to give you an idea of the level of damage that had been inflicted upon her. One of her eyes was swollen shut, and there was swelling on her forehead and left ear. There was subcutaneous hemorrhaging on her neck, as well as under one of her ears, the entire right side of her face, back of head, left forehead, left eye, left cheek, and left side of her neck. Furthermore, there were significant injuries to all of her nether regions, even evidence of a needle being inserted at some point in time. The bruising on her neck, as well as the bleeding and the damage to the windpipe and the hyoid bone, indicated that there was direct pressure on her neck. Her stomach was completely empty except for the presence of blood-stained mucus. Her liver and adrenal glands were also injured. A horrific and brutal ending to a life that had barely just begun. On the very night that baby Caithlyn was admitted to hospital, her mother, Maureen, was admitted to the psychiatric ward. However, she soon ran away, disappeared, and allegedly moved back to the streets. Unfortunately, no one was able to locate her, and thus even a victim impact statement for the later court case was unable to be obtained. You know, one of the saddest parts for me within this case is that this little baby, this innocent infant, would ultimately be buried without either her mother or her father, both of the individuals who gave her life, present. Not that either could even be classified as parents though, in my very humble opinion. And so after Hugo's arrest, the case would ultimately begin. And as for mainstream media coverage, it was at a bare minimum, which in itself was quite surprising considering the horrific nature of the crime. After his arrest, Hugo would be sent in 2024, the following year, to Sterkfontein Psychiatric Hospital for a psychiatric evaluation, where he was ultimately found fit to stand trial. During this time period, he had been in custody in Polokwane since 2023 when he was arrested. At his court appearances, when the news of his disturbing actions towards baby Caithlyn were read out, there were audible gasps that could be heard from many of the public attendees. Appearance after appearance, almost 2 years later, there was finally an end in sight, when on the 7th of February 2025, Hugo would plead guilty to the charges against him, namely murder and rape. He would go on to sign a plea agreement, and within his plea explanation, he had stated, and I quote, "I accept that this was a brutal and violent assault, especially on such a small baby. I admit that I acted intentionally." He would later add that although he was under the influence of substances at the time, he realized that as the father of the baby, he had a duty to care for and protect her. He would end by saying, and I once again quote, "My actions were unacceptable." End quote. So just a quick recap, within the plea documentation, he would attest that he knew his actions were wrong, even though he was under the influence of meth. He stated that he acted in anger towards Maureen, taking it out on an innocent newborn. He would go on to say that he acted intentionally, and he could still recall the events of the day almost 2 years later. The case was then postponed to the 25th of February for a pre-sentence report. In essence, this type of report basically showcases the background of the individual in question to allow the court to ultimately decide on an appropriate sentence. In this report, it would be heard how Hugo harbored feelings of rejection and anger towards his mother his entire life. He supposedly had the same type of feelings towards his ex-wife, the one with the protection order out against him, and additionally had no relationship whatsoever with his father. All of those were listed as mitigating factors within his sentencing process. However, it's important to keep in mind that along with a history of violence, Hugo had 5 previous convictions, including assault with the intent to cause grievous bodily harm back in December of 2022. Along with his heinous actions, the state put forward that it is evident that Hugo was a violent and aggressive individual who was a danger to society. Now that is most definitely evident. The probation officer in the case would later attest to the fact that it appeared that baby Caithlyn's only desire and goal as a premature baby was to stay alive, with the help of a responsible adult or adults who would protect her. But instead, she received the opposite. She was not cared for or protected. Instead, she was harmed in the worst way possible. She was defenseless and she couldn't even fight back. Biologically speaking, in the neonatal stage, the newborn is adapting to the outside world. They learn how to regulate their own blood circulation, breathing, digestion, and body temperature. As with newborns, her fontanelle, the opening in her skull, had not yet closed, and her neck muscles were weak. Like any newborn, she had no sense of danger, no ability to protect herself. She relied entirely on the people around her to see to her most basic needs. And that's important to remember throughout this entire case. You see, the court wasn't just looking at what had happened, but also at who had held power and what that power had ultimately meant over a life that was completely defenseless. After many months, in April of 2025, in the Pretoria High Court, 37-year-old Hugo Ferreira would be sentenced to 2 life terms and murder of baby Caithlyn Ferreira. The judge in the case would find no justification for departing from the prescribed minimum sentence, finding Hugo's actions cruel, reckless, and monstrous. I mean, I have other words in addition to those ones for his actions, but let me not share them publicly. Hugo did not flinch as his disturbing actions of that day were recounted in court. The court would ultimately find that Hugo showed no remorse and that the murder was premeditated. During the pre-sentence report, he had also stated how he wanted to and would take the life of baby Caithlyn's mother, Maureen, if he had the chance to. Threats that indicated that not only did he lack remorse, but he had a very low chance of rehabilitation. Before we get into the psychology of the case, I need to say something clearly, because cases like these don't just disturb us, they activate something deeper. When a crime involves an infant, our brains scramble for explanations that help us to feel safer. We desperately want something external to blame, whether that is a substance, a breakdown, a moment of madness, anything that helps us to believe that this type of harm exists outside of normal, ordinary human choice. I mean, and I understand that instinct, because if a crime was caused by something rare or foreign to the ordinary, then we can distance ourselves from it. We can tell ourselves that this is an anomaly. But unfortunately, psychology does not support that comfort. What it shows us instead is something far more unsettling. That the most extreme harm comes from ordinary human mechanisms taken to their most dangerous extreme. Before we go any further, there's something I need to clarify, because mental health labels get thrown around really quickly in cases like this one. Despite Hugo insisting that he had been diagnosed with both psychopathy and bipolar disorder in 2024, court records tell a different story. The only diagnoses formally noted in the proceedings were antisocial personality disorder, often referred to as APD, and drug dependence. And that distinction matters far more than people realize. Antisocial personality disorder is not psychopathy, and it's not bipolar disorder either. APD is characterized by a long-term pattern of disregard for the rights and safety of others, difficulty with empathy, impulsivity, and a lack of internalized moral obligation. But here's the part that often gets ignored. People with APD generally know the difference between right or wrong. They understand the rules, they just don't feel bound by them in the same way. And this is where I'm going to say something that's potentially a little controversial. Mental health diagnoses are often used as shields in cases like these, not because they explain the behavior, but because they make us more comfortable than admitting that someone acted with awareness and choice. And on a side note, the court did not accept APD as an excuse because it isn't one. It provides context, not compulsion. It does not remove accountability, and it does not cause someone to commit violence, especially against a child. Which brings us directly to one of the first explanations raised in this case that I often see within the comment sections on social media. And that is that substances not only played a role, but were essentially to blame for the horrific actions that occurred. Well, it's true that substances can lower inhibition and can affect impulse control, judgment, and emotional regulation. That's real, and it's well documented. But here's the part that people don't like to sit with. Substances do not create desires. They do not manufacture values. They do not generate violence that was not psychologically possible for the person prior to that point. What they do is remove restraint. Let me say it again, and let me say it slowly. What they do is remove restraint. If substances truly caused acts like this, we would see it constantly. We would see infants harmed every single time someone used meth or any other substance. And yet, we don't. So the real question isn't what the substances did, it's what the substances allowed. And that answer forces us to confront something far more uncomfortable. That the barrier stopping this behavior was not morality, but it was inhibition. And once that barrier was lowered, the behavior emerged. And to truly understand this case properly, we need to talk about power, because power is the psychological engine that is driving everything at play here. Think about a newborn baby for a minute. An infant represents absolute vulnerability. There's no resistance, no ability to escape, no capacity to name harm, and no way to be believed in the moment. When you look at this through a psychological lens, that vulnerability isn't just part of the picture. It's what the picture is built around. Violence directed at someone this defenseless is almost never about the victim. It's about what the offender is trying to assert within themselves. Control, dominance, entitlement, the need to feel powerful when otherwise they feel inadequate, overwhelmed, or insignificant. There's also a role violation that we cannot minimize. A parent is biologically and socially positioned as a protector. That role grants access, trust, and authority. When that role is abused, it tells us that this was not chaos, but rather exploitation. We literally can't even try and say something along the lines of, he snapped, because snapping implies a loss of control. And what we're seeing here is, well, it's quite the opposite. We can see control being exercised over someone who has none. And that is deeply unsettling, because it means that this was not confusion or panic. It was a moment where power was available and it was used. And that design and abuse of power links inextricably with sexual violence. Sexual violence is one of the most misunderstood forms of violence, and this case in particular causes us to confront the misunderstanding directly. Many people assume sexual violence is driven by attraction. Psychology tells us that this is rarely the case. Much more often, it is driven by domination, entitlement, and a desire to dehumanize. Think about it like this. In situations involving extreme vulnerability, the sexual Violence aspect operates as a tool, a way of asserting total control, stripping the victim of personhood and reinforcing absolute power. And here's the part that people rarely want to say out loud. Extreme vulnerability attracts a certain type of offenders. Not because the victim causes anything, no, but because the vulnerability removes resistance, removes witnesses, and removes accountability in the moment. That understanding, therefore, doesn't make the sexual act impulsive, it makes it predatory. Violence at this level is not about losing control. It's about choosing to exercise it. Look, I could explain concepts and behaviors till I'm blue in the face, but the fact remains that there's no explanation in this case that makes what happened acceptable. There is no substance, no stressor, and no circumstance that transfers responsibility. What remains is accountability and a life that mattered. When I talk about cases like this, my goal is never to shock or to outrage, it's to provide clarity. Because clarity is how we stop excuses from becoming shelters for further harm. Before I end this episode, I want to say her name, Caithlyn Ferreira. She wasn't simply a case or a headline. She was a baby, a 2.4 kg newborn whose only instinct was to survive. Her only way of asking for help was to cry. She depended completely on the adults around her to keep her safe, but that safety never came. What happened to her wasn't because she was weak. It was because she was vulnerable, and vulnerability should never be a death sentence. Caithlyn mattered. Her life mattered. And if you remember anything from this case, let it be this. Children deserve protection always, especially when they cannot protect themselves. Thank you for being here and for honoring baby Caithlyn's life through listening to her story. What broke my heart even more after I heard it was that the only picture of baby Caithlyn was the one that was taken during her autopsy. Though brief, her light will live on and her memory will never be forgotten. Until we meet again, stay safe, stay blessed, and stay the amazing human beings that I know each and every single one of you are. Bye!